On November 2nd, 2022, a journalist published an article 9 days later, a company valued at $32 billion no longer existed. $8 billion in customer money was gone. And the man who took it was sleeping in a penthouse in the Bahamas. This is the full story of how FTX collapsed and why it happened faster than almost anyone thought possible. Beat won the empire. To understand how FTX fell apart, you have to understand what it was and how fast it had been built. Sam Bankman-Fried, known universally as SBF, co-founded a trading firm called Alameda Research in 2017. He was 25 years old. He had worked briefly at Jane Street Capital, one of Wall Street's most sophisticated quantitative trading firms, and he understood market mechanics at a level most people his age never would. Alameda started as an arbitrage operation, finding price differences in cryptocurrency markets across different exchanges and profiting from the gap. It worked well. Better than well. In 2019, SBF had a new idea: build his own exchange. The idea was that running a crypto exchange was more profitable than trading on one. The exchange always gets paid regardless of which direction the market moves. It collects fees from everyone on every trade. And if you also run a trading firm, you can bring massive liquidity to your own exchange, making it more attractive to other traders. That exchange was FTX. What happened next was one of the most spectacular rises in the history of financial markets. By January 2022, just 3 years after founding, FTX had been valued at $32 billion in a venture capital funding round. SBF's personal net worth was estimated at $16 billion. He was 30 years old. FTX had celebrity endorsers: Tom Brady, Steph Curry, Shaquille O'Neal. They had naming rights to the Miami Heat arena, the FTX arena. They had a Super Bowl commercial. SBF was being discussed in Washington as a potential future Treasury Secretary. He was testifying before Congress about crypto regulation as an expert, not a defendant. He was donating hundreds of millions of dollars to political campaigns and pandemic preparedness causes. He was, by every visible measure, one of the most credible figures in the entire cryptocurrency industry. And here's what almost nobody outside of his inner circle understood. Underneath all of it, there was a secret that would unravel everything. FTX and Alameda Research were not two separate companies. Not really. Alameda Research had been given a secret exemption from FTX's own liquidation protocols, the safeguards that were supposed to automatically close losing trading positions before they threatened the exchange's solvency. Alameda was allowed to run losing trades that no other user could. And more critically, Alameda Research had been borrowing from FTX's customer deposit accounts to fund its own trading operations. Customer money, deposits that people had placed on FTX believing it was safe, being moved into Alameda Research's trading accounts and used to make speculative bets. This was not disclosed to customers. It was explicitly prohibited by FTX's own terms of service, and it had been happening for years. Beat 2, the article, November 2nd, 2022. CoinDesk, a cryptocurrency news publication, publishes a story. The article is based on a leaked balance sheet from Alameda Research. And what it reveals is this: a significant portion of Alameda's assets on its balance sheet consist of FTT tokens, the proprietary cryptocurrency that FTX itself had created and issued. Here's why that matters. FTT is a token that only has value because FTX has value. If FTX struggles, FTT loses value. If Alameda's balance sheet is dependent on FTT holding its value, then Alameda's financial health is directly tied to FTX's reputation remaining intact. In other words, the trading firm that was supposed to be a separate company was actually a house of cards built on top of the exchange. And the exchange was a house of cards built on top of customer deposits. The article goes live on a Wednesday morning. The crypto world reads it. Most people note it with concern but not alarm. FTX is a $32 billion company. Surely the balance sheet has more to it than what's visible in a leaked document. Then Changpeng Zhao enters the picture. Zhao, known as CZ, is the founder and CEO of Binance, the world's largest crypto exchange. He and SBF had a history of public disputes and competitive tension. On November 6th, 4 days after the CoinDesk article, CZ announced on Twitter that Binance would be selling its entire position in FTT tokens. Binance held approximately $529 million worth of FTT. That tweet was the match. The market immediately understood what was happening. If Binance dumps $500 million of FTT into the market, the price of FTT collapses. If FTT collapses, Alameda's balance sheet collapses. If Alameda collapses, FTX is exposed. Customers didn't wait to find out if the logic held. They started withdrawing their funds from FTX immediately. What happened in the next 72 hours is one of the most rapid financial collapses in corporate history. This is where the floor falls out. Subscribe to Boardroom Bio. We cover stories like this every week. Hit the like button. It really does help. Now let's get into the 72 hours. Beat 3, the 72 hours. November 7th, FTX is facing a wave of withdrawal requests. The number being thrown around internally, $6 billion in a single day. $6 billion walking out the door. FTX did not have $6 billion available to meet those withdrawals because the money wasn't there. A significant portion of customer deposits had been moved to Alameda Research, and Alameda had lost much of it in the market downturn of 2022. In May and June of 2022, a separate crypto collapse, the Terra Luna ecosystem, had wiped out tens of billions of dollars of market value across the industry. Alameda Research had been heavily exposed to those losses. And according to later testimony in court, FTX had at that point lent Alameda more than half of its total customer deposits to cover those losses. The $8 billion hole in FTX's accounts had existed for months. The CoinDesk article and CZ's tweet just forced everyone to look at it at the same time. November 8th, SBF and CZ put out a joint announcement. Binance has signed a non-binding letter of intent to acquire FTX. Binance will rescue the exchange. Customers will be protected. Markets briefly stabilize. People hold their breath. 32 hours later, Binance is out. CZ released a statement on November 9th. As a result of corporate due diligence, as well as the latest news reports regarding mishandled customer funds and alleged U.S. agency investigations, we have decided that we will not pursue the potential acquisition of FTX.com. The moment Binance pulled out FTX was finished. The exchange halted all withdrawals. Customers who still had money on the platform discovered they could not access it. The FTX website, which had been processing billions of dollars in transactions days earlier, showed a single message: withdrawals are paused. November 11th, FTX files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. 130 affiliated companies, including Alameda Research and FTX US, file simultaneously. John J. Ray 3, the restructuring specialist who had overseen the unwinding of Enron, is brought in as the new CEO. SBF resigns. Ray's initial assessment of FTX's records is delivered to the bankruptcy court in November 2022 and became immediately famous. He had overseen some of the largest corporate failures in American history, and his conclusion about FTX was direct. Never in my career have I seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information. The company with $32 billion in enterprise value had been operating at the executive level essentially without accounting, without proper board oversight, without the basic financial controls that any legitimate business of any size is expected to maintain. Employees reportedly communicated about financial decisions via disappearing messages. Key decisions were made by a small inner circle of people, many of whom had personal and romantic entanglements with each other. Financial records were described as incomplete or non-existent. Before the trial. December 12th, 2022. Sam Bankman-Fried is arrested in the Bahamas. He is extradited to the United States and released on a $25 million bond. The case that followed was one of the most closely watched financial fraud trials in decades. 3 of SBF's closest associates, Caroline Ellison, the CEO of Alameda Research, Gary Wang, FTX's co-founder, and Nishad Singh, FTX's head of engineering, pleaded guilty to fraud charges and agreed to cooperate with the government. All 3 testified in court that it was Bankman-Fried who had directed them to move customer funds into Alameda, that it was Bankman-Fried who had approved the secret exemption from auto liquidation, that it was Bankman-Fried who had known about the $8 billion hole in the accounts. SBF's defense was essentially this: he made mistakes. He hadn't fully understood the risk. he hadn't intended to defraud anyone. He had genuinely believed Alameda would eventually be able to repay what it had borrowed from customer deposits. On November 2nd, 2023, exactly 1 year to the day after the CoinDesk article that started everything, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all 7 counts. Wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. On March 28th, 2024, Sam Bankman-Fried was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to forfeit $11.02 billion. He was 32 years old. Beat 5, the lesson. Here's what the FTX story is actually about. Not crypto, not regulation, not even fraud in the traditional sense. The FTX story is about what happens when an institution and a person becomes too big to question. SBF was credible because he was smart. He was trusted because he was charitable. He was given access to regulators and politicians because he presented himself as the responsible adult in a chaotic industry. And all of that credibility, all of that social capital became a shield that allowed an $8 billion hole to exist for months without anyone on the outside asking the right questions. The venture capitalists who gave him hundreds of millions of dollars didn't ask hard questions about the relationship between FTX and Alameda Research. The celebrities who endorsed the brand didn't review the balance sheet. The politicians who took his donations didn't investigate the source of the money. The media largely celebrated the story they were being told. And here's the brutal reality. The customers who lost their money, real people who deposited real savings onto what they believed was a legitimate exchange, had almost no way of knowing what was happening on the other side of their screen. They trusted a system that presented the appearance of legitimacy while operating with none of the substance of it. $32 billion, built in 3 years, gone in 9 days. The fastest corporate collapse in modern financial history. Fueled not by a market crash, not by a bad product, not by a competitor, but by a secret that was always just one article away from becoming public. That's Boardroom Bio. Subscribe for a new story every week and tell me in the comments, should SBF have gotten 25 years or more?